we met up with Jeff Arnett, master distiller at Jack Daniel's.
The term cinnamon, the spice that was identified that was properly called cinnamon, only came from one place on the planet, and it comes from Sri Lanka. What I find with Old No. 7 is it balances between the sweet and bitter zone. So it's almost equal parts sweet and oak. So it won't favor the tip of the tongue or the back of the throat. It almost now, to call yourself a bourbon whiskey, you can't just be made anywhere. You have to be made in America. It's considered to be America's native spirit, if you will. So it has to be a product of one of the 50 U.S. states. It doesn't have to come from Kentucky. But most people think of bourbon, they think of the state of Kentucky. It can be made in any U.S. state. The next requirement is it has to not just be any grain. It has to be 51% corn on its grain bill, where like a Scotch whiskey would be malted barley, single grain. With bourbon, it's got to be 51% corn, but the other 49% is entirely up to you. But just corn's got to be the first grain in your deal. You're not allowed to simply distill your whiskey and be called bourbon. You have to distill it below 160, or globally whiskeys begin at 189. The higher you distill, the higher the proof, the less character you have. Things like vodka are distilled very, very high, distilled multiple times, and that's kind of stripping the character or flavor out of it. The lower you distill, the more flavor you bring across. So bourbon has a lower maximum distillation limit, which means it should have more flavor off the still. So this is another thing that defines bourbon. The biggest difference of bourbon whiskey and all the other whiskeys is the type of barrel that you're allowed to use. If you call yourself bourbon, you are not allowed to reuse barrels. So every time you're putting your distillate up, it has to go into a brand new charred oak barrel. All of the things that I just said about bourbon are also true of Jack Daniel's. Most American whiskeys were rye whiskeys. You probably have heard that rye whiskey's making sort of a renaissance again. There's been a revival, a lot more rye whiskeys in the marketplace today than there were 5 or 6 years ago. But prior to Prohibition, rye whiskey was the main form of American whiskey. Bourbon whiskey and Tennessee whiskey that you know today largely happened after Prohibition, so that would be after the 1930s era. But introducing a grain bill that's very low in rye at a time when rye whiskey was the norm, I think gives me some insight into what Jack Daniel, Jasper Newton Daniel, what was he hoping to accomplish by making this whiskey and choosing this grain bill? It was not logical. It was going to be different. And I think that kind of speaks to who Jack was. He did not want his whiskey to taste like everybody else's. And I think if you start tasting around, I know that Scotch is very popular here. If you think about American whiskey, you often think of bourbon first. But we have billboards that say it's not Scotch, it's not bourbon, it's Jack. And I think if you taste Scotch and you taste bourbon, you taste Jack Daniel's, you realize that it is. It's very unique, it's very different in its character. But I truly believe that that's what Jack Daniel hoped to accomplish. He wanted to make a great whiskey, one that would be noteworthy, that would be medal-worthy and win competitions, but more importantly, not taste like the others. So a very unique grain bill that we use here, but a very natural process too. So once we get the cave spring water, was Jasper Newton Daniel, which I think is actually pretty cool that he called himself Jack, because I'm not sure anybody would want to walk in a bar and order a Jasper and Coke. That's nowhere near as cool as ordering a Jack and Coke. But Jack always told people that he was born in September of 1850. We don't have a birth record for him, so we're not sure. There have been some people who told us that he might have been born a couple of years before that time, but Jack was a lifelong bachelor, so he never got married. The passions of his life that we know of were whiskey making and music. And you actually see those themes still kind of throughout the Jack Daniel's brand, even to this day. But let me tell you a little bit about Jack. First of all, he was not born into a privileged situation. He was the 10th child born to his mother, and she died shortly after his birth, possibly from complications of his birth. So he never knew his biological mother. His father was still a fairly young man, so his father remarried. So Jack ended up with a stepmother and 3 half-sisters. So Jack was the 10th child born to his father, but his father had 13 children. And his father died when he was a young teenager. And at that point, Jack decided not to stay at home with his stepmother and half-sisters. He moved away and began to work for his room and board. Where he moved was to a neighbor's farm. The neighbor's name was Dan Call, and he was a Lutheran minister, so he was a preacher at the local church. He held a farm just outside the city limits of Lynchburg, pretty small place, but a mile or so out. He had about a 300-acre farm. And he owned the general store that's on the square. I'm actually going to show you a photo of that here in a moment. And back in the 1850s and 1860s, you know, Lynchburg is a small town today. It was a small town back in that time too. A hardware store, a general store in a small town had to be like a small-scale department store. It had to do a lot of things in a community. You went to the general store and you could buy clothing, you could buy hardware, you could buy farm implements. You picked up telegrams there because nobody had a telephone. And more importantly, it also served as a pharmacy for the community. So it was very typical, if you went into a general store back in the 1800s, there would be a medicinal whiskey somewhere in the back of the store, an alchemist, somebody who had knowledge of herbs and ingredients who could take it and mix it onto a medicinal whiskey base and make different remedies for the community. So that's how Jack got his start. That's how he learned to make whiskey. He was living on a Lutheran minister's farm, and he started making medicinal whiskey that was sold in a general store, literally for remedies for the community. And from those very humble beginnings, like I said today, Jack would be considered the #1 selling single. Okay, right, there's a fan club that exists for Jack Daniels, and it has since 1955, roughly. And it was in that year that Frank Sinatra, when Jack Daniels was a very small, regional, not very well-known brand, Frank Sinatra held Jack Daniels up on stage and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Jack Daniels and it's the nectar of the gods." And that changed our world because the next year our sales doubled. And for the next 25 years, we could not make enough Jack Daniels to supply the United States, much less ship anything outside the U.S. But in the midst of that shortage, we decided to create a fan club where we would write letters and be in communication with people who were looking for bottles of Jack Daniels and couldn't find them. We would write to them and tell them to be patient with us, that we were adding on to the distillery, we were trying to catch up. So this fan club's been around since